Have you ever noticed how a single word can change the course of your day? Sometimes, it's a smile paired with a thank you, or a soft I appreciate you, whispered at just the right moment. It seems almost invisible, fleeting like a breath carried away by the wind. Yet its effect can linger, planting seeds that bloom long after the words have left your lips. In the quiet corners of human interaction, words are not merely sounds or symbols on a page. They are tiny offerings, delicate as petals, capable of bringing warmth where there was cold, clarity where there was confusion, and hope where there was despair. The Buddha often spoke of speech as a reflection of the mind, and in that reflection lies a profound truth. The words we choose are mirrors of the heart we carry. Imagine, for a moment, holding a flower in your hand. Its fragrance is subtle but undeniable. Its colors may be vivid or soft, yet they capture attention effortlessly. Offering this flower to someone is more than a gesture. It is a silent expression of care, a gift of beauty meant to touch the soul. This is the essence of a kind word. It is a flower we extend without expecting anything in return. It is an act of giving, a moment of mindfulness and an expression of love. Words, when spoken with awareness, have the power to heal. They can soothe a troubled mind, calm an anxious heart, and lift spirits that feel weighed down by the burdens of life. Consider the times when a few simple words from a friend changed your outlook, when a gentle comment turned a day of frustration into one of gratitude. The magic is not in the words themselves, but in the intention behind them, the presence of genuine care, the subtle energy of compassion. And yet, despite their power, words are often treated carelessly. We throw them around like pebbles, sometimes sharp, sometimes heavy, rarely noticing the ripples they create. A harsh word can cut deeper than any physical wound, leaving invisible scars. A thoughtless remark can linger in the mind of another, quietly shaping their perception of themselves and the world. The Buddha teaches us to speak with mindfulness, to cultivate right speech as part of the path to awakening. Each word is a choice, and with each choice, we have the opportunity to plant a seed of kindness or a seed of harm. This journey is not about perfection. It is about awareness, intention, and the courage to transform the ordinary act of speaking into a practice of care. Picture every conversation, every greeting, every casual remark as a chance to offer a flower. Sometimes, it is just a word of encouragement. Other times, it is a sentence that helps someone see light in a dark moment. And sometimes, it is simply the soft acknowledgement that another human being exists and matters. As we explore the landscape of words in the chapters ahead, notice how they move through the mind and heart, how they shape relationships, and how they reflect the depth of our humanity. From planting seeds of positivity to witnessing the ripples they create in the world, we will uncover the profound truth that even the simplest word, when offered with sincerity, is a gift beyond measure. So take a moment now. Breathe in. Consider the words you have spoken today, the words you are about to speak, and the unseen garden they are planting in the lives of others. Each one has the potential to bloom, to touch, and to transform. A kind word is never just a word, it is a flower, and in giving it, we are giving a piece of ourselves. Think of the words you speak as seeds, small, almost imperceptible, yet capable of growing into forests of change. Every compliment, every gentle encouragement, every sincere, "I believe in you," is a seed planted in the fertile soil of someone's heart. And just like seeds, the effects of these words are not always immediate. Sometimes they lie quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to sprout, to take root, and to bloom. In the Buddha's teachings, every action carries consequences, karma. Words are no exception. A single kind word can create ripples of positivity that extend far beyond the initial moment. It might lift someone's spirits, inspire confidence, or even shift the trajectory of a life in ways we cannot immediately see. Just as a single seed can grow into a towering tree, one thoughtful word can create a canopy of warmth and understanding. Picture a child sitting alone in a corner, feeling unnoticed, unheard. Then imagine someone saying, "You matter," or "I see your effort and it is meaningful." Those few words are like planting a seed of hope. They may seem small at first, but over time they can grow into courage, self-belief, and resilience. The child may carry that seed into adulthood, and in turn, plant seeds of kindness in others. Words have this remarkable quality. They can create a chain reaction of goodness. When spoken with care and mindfulness, they reinforce the best parts of our humanity. They remind us that we are connected, that our actions, no matter how small, influence the world around us. Each kind word is an act of cultivation, tending to the garden of relationships, the unseen forest of minds touched by our speech. And yet, planting seeds with words requires conscious effort. In the hustle of daily life, it is easy to speak without thought, to let irritation or impatience dictate our tone. But mindfulness transforms this ordinary act into a sacred practice. When we pause before speaking, even for a moment, we consider the effect our words might have. We ask ourselves, will this plant something beautiful or will it sow bitterness? It is not about perfection, but about intention. A seed does not bloom instantly. It grows with time, nourished by patience, care, and attention. Similarly, words spoken with sincerity need room to take root in the hearts of others. And as we continue to practice, we begin to notice a subtle but powerful transformation, not just in those around us, but in ourselves. Our speech becomes an expression of our inner kindness, a reflection of our own growth, a mirror of the compassion we cultivate within. Imagine a world where every conversation, no matter how brief, is treated as a chance to plant a seed of positivity, where compliments, encouragement, and gentle words are scattered freely, like petals in the wind. The energy of these seeds travels far, often reaching places we will never see. The person we uplift may go on to uplift another, and another, creating a tapestry of interconnected hearts nurtured by something as simple and as profound as a word. As you listen to this, consider the seeds you have planted today. Perhaps you have encouraged someone without realizing it. Perhaps a kind word you spoke long ago is still quietly growing in someone's heart. And as we move forward, we will explore how these seeds, when tended with care, can bloom into visible change, transforming lives, communities, and ultimately, the world around us. Have you ever witnessed a flower bloom? That slow, gentle unfolding of petals, revealing colors and fragrance that were hidden just moments before. Kind words have a similar magic. They start small, almost unnoticed, but given care, they unfold within the heart of the listener, revealing beauty, hope, and warmth that might have been buried beneath doubt, fear, or sorrow. Consider a person weighed down by worry. Perhaps they feel overlooked, unheard, or undervalued. Then, someone says, "I believe in you," or "You've done something remarkable." These words, tender and genuine, act like sunlight and rain falling on a seed. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, they awaken a sense of worth and possibility. The transformation may not be immediate, but over time, confidence blossoms, courage grows, and the heart feels lighter. The Buddha taught that compassion is not just a feeling. It is an action, an energy that flows outward. Words are one of the most immediate and powerful expressions of this compassion. When spoken with care, they carry the potential to lift spirits, ease burdens, and nurture resilience. Each word is a petal unfolding, a subtle yet profound change in the world of another person. Imagine a friend quietly struggling with self-doubt. A few thoughtful words, acknowledgement, encouragement, or simply listening can be enough to illuminate a path forward. The ripple effect begins. They feel supported, they regain strength, and their energy touches those around them. One kind word can multiply into countless others, creating an unseen network of positivity. Words do not only impact the obvious or visible outcomes. They seep into the deeper layers of the mind, shifting perceptions, softening hearts, and opening doors that seemed firmly closed. A single word of appreciation might spark creativity in someone who felt uninspired. A gentle expression of understanding could mend a fractured relationship. In this way, kind words bloom like flowers not only in the heart of the listener, but also in the environment around them. And the beauty of this effect is that it is reciprocal. When we offer words of kindness, we are also nurturing our own hearts. Each compassionate expression strengthens our awareness, patience, and empathy. It is a reminder that our speech is not merely communication. It is an act of creation, a way of cultivating beauty and harmony in the world. Yet, the blooming effect requires presence. Words carelessly spoken may wither before they take root. True kindness comes from attention, from noticing the needs of another and offering speech that resonates. Just as a gardener tends to their plants, we must cultivate our words with intention, ensuring they have the nourishment to grow and transform. Picture a single smile paired with a soft, encouraging word. It might seem inconsequential at first, but watch closely. It sparks confidence, ignites a sense of belonging, and spreads joy to others. That tiny bloom, a momentary gesture of care, can ripple through countless lives, showing us that the power of language is not measured by its volume or length, but by the depth of its sincerity. As we reflect on this, notice the subtle beauty in every kind word you hear or speak. Each one is a potential bloom, a tiny miracle of transformation waiting to unfold. And as these blooms multiply, they create a garden of compassion that nurtures both the giver and the receiver. The next step is understanding how to speak with intention, how to transform ordinary conversation into mindful practice, ensuring that every word we plant has the opportunity to flourish. And it is in that mindful space that we discover the true artistry of speech, the ability to turn simple words into enduring gifts of the heart. Have you ever paused before speaking and truly felt the weight of your words? In our daily lives, words often spill out like water from a faucet, fast, unfiltered, and without much thought. Yet just as a single seed grows into a mighty tree only when nurtured carefully, words spoken with intention have the power to transform hearts, relationships, and even communities. Mindful communication begins with awareness. It's not merely about avoiding hurtful words, but about cultivating a sensitivity to the impact your speech has on others. Each conversation is an opportunity, a chance to plant seeds of kindness, to offer clarity where there is confusion, and to create space for understanding and empathy. The Buddha emphasized right speech as a cornerstone of the path to awakening. Right speech is gentle, truthful, and purposeful. It avoids falsehood, harshness, and idle chatter. Speaking with intention is an extension of this principle. It means choosing words that uplift rather than wound, that heal rather than harm. Imagine a tense moment with a friend or colleague. The instinct might be to react immediately, to speak quickly, to defend, or to criticize. But when we pause, even for a brief moment, we allow space for awareness. We ask ourselves, do my words serve compassion? Do they plant seeds of growth, or will they sow doubt and pain? In that pause lies the essence of mindful communication. Intentional speech is also about honesty. It is not about speaking perfect words or avoiding all conflict. It is about expressing truth in a way that is sensitive and constructive. Sometimes the most meaningful words are simple, an acknowledgement of another's feelings, a gentle correction, or a heartfelt apology. These words, though seemingly small, carry the weight of authenticity and care. Consider the rhythm of everyday life. We greet, we discuss, we argue, we console. Within each exchange lies an opportunity to transform ordinary speech into sacred practice. A kind word, thoughtfully chosen, is like sunlight falling on a tender sprout. Over time, these words accumulate, strengthening trust, deepening connection, and creating an environment where compassion can flourish naturally. Mindful communication also involves listening. True understanding begins not with speaking, but with hearing. Listening deeply allows us to perceive the unspoken needs, fears, and hopes of those around us. Only then can our words be truly intentional, responding not from habit or ego, but from awareness and empathy. Every word we speak leaves an imprint, subtle yet enduring. Speaking with intention is a practice of responsibility and creativity. It transforms speech from a mechanical act into a meaningful gift, capable of nurturing growth and well-being. When we approach communication this way, we begin to notice a shift, not just in how others respond to us, but in the quality of our own inner life. Our minds become calmer, our hearts more open, and our connections richer. As you move through your day, imagine each interaction as a choice to plant seeds, to water the garden of someone else's heart, to offer words that carry light rather than shadow. Speaking with intention is a daily practice, a gentle art of creating beauty and compassion with nothing more than our voice. And as these mindful words begin to take root and bloom in the lives of others, we begin to see the extraordinary power of speech. Words, carefully chosen and sincerely spoken, are not just tools. They are instruments of transformation, capable of nurturing joy, peace, and understanding in ways that resonate far beyond the moment they are spoken. Have you ever paused to notice how your words reveal who you are? Not just what you think, but the very essence of your character, your values, and your inner world. Words are more than tools for communication. They are mirrors reflecting the heart within, showing others and even ourselves the state of our mind and spirit. When we speak with compassion, patience, and honesty, our words carry the imprint of virtue. They reveal kindness that may otherwise remain unseen, patience that steadies the mind, and wisdom that guides gently. Conversely, words spoken in haste, anger, or pride often expose the turbulence within, echoing dissatisfaction or unrest. Every syllable is a reflection, silently telling the world and reminding ourselves who we truly are. Imagine a moment when someone offers you a compliment or encouragement. Their words can feel like a mirror, reflecting not only their perception of you, but also the goodness they see, or perhaps aspire to cultivate themselves. In Buddhism, the interplay of speech and karma shows us that words do not exist in isolation. They carry both the essence of the speaker and the potential to influence the listener. Your words, when rooted in virtue, act as gentle beacons. They illuminate the path for others, offering guidance without force, nurturing without intrusion. A simple thank you or I appreciate your effort may seem small, yet it communicates acknowledgement, respect, and recognition, virtues that strengthen relationships and deepen human connection. And here's the remarkable truth: the virtue reflected in our words often feeds back into our own hearts. Speaking kindly, truthfully, and wisely nurtures qualities within ourselves. Each expression of compassion strengthens our capacity for patience. Each word of encouragement reinforces empathy, and each mindful utterance deepens awareness. Words become not only mirrors for others, but also instruments for our own inner growth. Consider the transformative power of reflection. When we notice that harsh words leave ripples of discomfort in others, we learn to temper our speech. When we see that gentle words inspire confidence and calm, we recognize the virtues within us waiting to be expressed more fully. Words, in essence, are a feedback loop between the self and the world, a continuous mirror showing what is cultivated and what still requires care. The Buddha often emphasized the unity of thought, word, and action. Our speech is inseparable from our mind. A mind filled with anger, jealousy, or pride tends to produce words that harm, while a heart cultivated with kindness and wisdom naturally produces speech that uplifts. Mindful awareness of this connection transforms our words into mirrors, revealing not only who we are, but also guiding us toward who we aspire to become. Imagine walking through a quiet forest of human interaction, each word you speak leaving a reflective imprint on the lives around you. Some words may cast shadows, some may glimmer with light, but all carry the essence of your inner being. By choosing words that reflect virtue, we plant reflections of integrity, patience, and compassion, creating a subtle yet profound impact that extends far beyond our immediate presence. As you continue on this journey, notice your words as reflections, mirrors of your inner landscape. Ask yourself, are they revealing the compassion, wisdom, and clarity within? Or are they revealing impatience, judgment, or agitation? By treating speech as a mirror, each conversation becomes an opportunity for self-awareness and refinement, turning everyday interaction into a practice of moral and spiritual cultivation. And as these reflections take shape, they naturally guide us toward mindful action, compassionate decision-making, and deeper connection. The mirror of words shows us not only who we are, but who we have the potential to be, a source of light, understanding, and inspiration in a world that so often yearns for kindness. Have you ever experienced the quiet, unexpected relief of hearing the right words at the right time? Perhaps someone said, "I'm here for you," or "It's okay to feel what you're feeling," and suddenly the weight pressing on your chest seemed just a little lighter. Words have the power to heal, to comfort, to reach the places within us where touch cannot go. In Buddhism, speech is more than a means of communication. It is a tool for transformation. Just as a gentle hand can soothe a wound, words spoken with care and compassion can mend the invisible fractures of the heart. Healing does not always require grand gestures. Often, it is a soft acknowledgement, a kind observation, or a sincere expression of support that brings the most profound relief. Picture someone struggling with loss, disappointment, or self-doubt. They may feel isolated, unheard, or overwhelmed. A single phrase, simple yet heartfelt, can act as a bridge between despair and hope. "You are not alone. I see your effort," or "It's okay to take your time." These words are gentle offerings, petals of encouragement that touch the soul. They validate feelings, affirm existence, and create space for healing. Healing through words is not just about comforting others, it is about presence. When we speak with genuine care, we are fully present with the listener. Our attention, our intention, and the quiet energy behind our speech become instruments of solace. In that presence, a wounded heart finds acknowledgement, and the mind experiences relief. Encouragement, too, is a subtle but potent form of healing. Words that affirm potential, recognize resilience, or inspire courage help awaken the strengths that were always there, quietly waiting to be discovered. They act like sunlight filtering through dense clouds, revealing clarity and possibility. And as these words take root, they empower individuals to rise above fear, doubt, and despair. Consider the ripple effect of healing speech. One comforting word may lift someone who, in turn, speaks a word of hope to another. Compassion spreads quietly, invisibly, yet with a force that can transform entire communities. Healing is not contained within a single conversation. It multiplies, shaping the world through subtle but profound acts of verbal care. Yet, the practice of healing through words requires mindfulness. Not every comment is helpful, even if intended kindly. Words must be measured, thoughtful, and attuned to the needs of the listener. Like a gardener tending delicate blooms, we must nurture healing words with attention, ensuring that they are gentle, timely, and sincere. Healing words also teach us about vulnerability and courage. To offer comfort, we must connect with our own compassion. To encourage another, we must believe in the potential for growth and resilience within ourselves. The act of speaking healing words becomes a mirror reflecting our own capacity for kindness, patience, and understanding. Imagine the countless moments in life where a kind word could make the difference between despair and hope, resignation and action, silence and expression. By cultivating the ability to offer healing speech, we transform ordinary interactions into sacred opportunities, turning simple conversation into acts of love, support, and connection. And as these words of comfort and encouragement are shared, notice how they resonate beyond the immediate moment. A single phrase can echo in someone's mind for days, weeks, or even years, gently reshaping perspectives, restoring confidence, and rekindling hope. Words, in this way, are not just communication. They are instruments of healing, capable of touching the heart in ways that transcend time and space. Have you ever dropped a pebble into a still pond and watched the ripples spread outward, touching every edge of the water? Words work in much the same way. A single act of kindness, a A simple word of encouragement can extend far beyond its initial point, touching lives in ways we may never fully witness. When we speak with sincerity and compassion, our words create invisible currents. They lift spirits, calm anxieties, and inspire actions that ripple outward into the world. One encouraging phrase may spark confidence in someone who then uplifts another person, creating a chain of positivity that grows silently yet powerfully. It's a reminder that our speech is not isolated. It is part of a vast web of human connection, where every word we offer has the potential to influence more than we can imagine. Consider a moment when you've seen the impact of a kind word firsthand. Perhaps a teacher's encouragement inspired a student to pursue their passion. Maybe a friend's thoughtful remark brought hope during a moment of despair. These small gestures carry an energy that spreads, reaching people who never even heard the original words. The effect is subtle but undeniable. Positivity multiplies not by force but through gentle resonance. In Buddhism, this is the essence of karma, the understanding that actions, including speech, ripple outward, returning in ways we may not anticipate. Every compassionate word we speak plants a seed not just for the listener, but for the larger network of connections surrounding them. And while we may never see the full extent of the impact, each ripple contributes to a more harmonious and supportive environment. Imagine a workplace where people greet each other with genuine appreciation. A single compliment or acknowledgement can spark a wave of goodwill, inspiring others to speak kindly and act with care. Or envision a community where everyday interactions are filled with gentle encouragement. Over time, this creates a culture of respect, understanding, and cooperation. What starts as a small gesture grows into a movement, a ripple effect that touches countless lives. The ripple effect also reminds us that even the smallest words matter. A thank you or well done may seem trivial, yet its influence can extend far beyond the moment it is spoken. A seemingly insignificant act of kindness can resonate with someone who is struggling, giving them the courage to act kindly toward others. And so, positivity continues to flow, expanding in ways we cannot measure, shaping a world that responds to compassion with compassion. Yet, creating this ripple requires mindfulness and intention. Words spoken without awareness can spread negativity just as easily as positivity. A harsh comment, an impatient remark, or a careless criticism can set off ripples of discomfort, tension, or misunderstanding. This is why mindful communication, which we explored earlier, is so essential. By choosing words that uplift and heal, we consciously participate in the creation of positive ripples. As we reflect on this, consider the words you will speak today. Each one is an opportunity to initiate a ripple of hope, encouragement, and joy. Imagine the unseen impact of every kind word you offer, the way it may inspire, comfort, or guide someone beyond what you can perceive. Every interaction becomes a chance to influence the world positively, one ripple at a time. The power of the ripple effect reminds us that our words, though small, are mighty. They can travel farther than we realize, touch hearts we may never meet, and create waves of change that extend beyond our immediate awareness. By speaking with care, we participate in a quiet, transformative movement where positivity flows outward like water, and the world becomes a gentler, more compassionate place. Even with the best intentions, speaking with kindness is not always easy. Life presents countless moments of frustration, impatience, and stress, times when words can slip out sharper than we intended, or when silence feels safer than expression. These are the obstacles that challenge our ability to communicate with compassion. Understanding them is the first step toward mastery. Anger, fear, and ego are powerful forces. They cloud our judgment and distort our words. A moment of irritation can produce a comment that leaves a lasting mark, while unchecked pride can turn even a simple conversation into a battlefield. The Buddha teaches that the mind must be observed, for the state of our inner world inevitably shapes the words we speak. When we fail to cultivate awareness, our speech becomes a reflection not of virtue, but of turmoil. Consider the times you've reacted hastily, spoken in frustration, snapped at a loved one, or allowed resentment to color your tone. The words may have been brief, but their impact lingers. In contrast, a moment of pause, a breath, or a simple question, "Is this helpful?" can prevent harm and create space for understanding. Self-mastery begins with noticing these impulses without judgment and choosing a response that reflects our highest values. Obstacles to kind speech are not external, they arise from within. Fatigue, stress, and emotional overwhelm make it difficult to access patience and clarity. But these challenges also present opportunities. Each moment of tension is a chance to practice restraint, mindfulness, and compassion. By observing our impulses, we can prevent harmful words from taking root and instead offer speech that nurtures and uplifts. Mindful awareness is key. When we become attuned to the triggers that provoke harsh speech, we gain the ability to pause, reflect, and respond intentionally. It is not about perfection, but about progress. The slow, steady cultivation of a mind that chooses words carefully, even under pressure. This awareness transforms obstacles into lessons and challenges into practice. Self-mastery also requires empathy. Recognizing that others, too, struggle with their inner storms helps us temper our words with understanding. In moments of conflict, a patient and compassionate response can diffuse tension, encourage dialogue, and foster connection. Words spoken from a place of awareness do not merely avoid harm, they actively create harmony. Imagine a conversation where frustration begins to rise. Instead of reacting impulsively, you pause, breathe, and speak from a space of calm. Your words become shields rather than swords, offering insight, clarity, and compassion. This is the art of self-mastery, aligning speech with awareness so that even in difficult moments, words become instruments of care rather than harm. Challenges will always exist, but each challenge is an invitation. Every obstacle in speech is a chance to cultivate mindfulness, refine character, and deepen understanding. By facing these internal hurdles with courage and awareness, we transform ordinary communication into a practice of virtue. As we continue, imagine the possibilities when every word is chosen thoughtfully, despite the obstacles. Words spoken with care, even in the face of difficulty, ripple outward, strengthening relationships, nurturing trust, and spreading positivity. Obstacles, once recognized and navigated, become the very moments that allow our speech to shine brightest. In the next exploration, we will see how this daily practice of mindful, virtuous speech can be woven seamlessly into life, creating a garden of words that nurtures, inspires, and transforms, showing that kindness is not just an ideal, but a lived reality in every interaction. Kindness is not a one-time act. It is a habit, a way of living that requires daily attention. Just as a gardener tends to soil, waters seeds, and removes weeds, we must nurture our words every day, cultivating a garden that flourishes with care, compassion, and intention. Each morning presents an opportunity. Before speaking, pause and consider, what will my words sow today? Will they plant seeds of encouragement, patience, and understanding? Or will they leave shadows in the hearts of others? This simple act of reflection transforms routine conversation into mindful practice, turning ordinary interactions into moments of cultivation. Start small. A greeting with genuine warmth, a compliment offered sincerely, or a thank you expressed from the heart may seem minor, yet these words are the sunlight and water that nurture your garden. Over time, these small gestures accumulate, creating a landscape of trust, kindness, and connection that shapes every environment you inhabit. Daily practice also means observing yourself. Notice the words you speak in moments of stress, frustration, or fatigue. Are they aligned with the values you wish to embody? Awareness allows you to prune careless speech, much like removing weeds that threaten the health of a garden. By doing so, you make space for words that uplift, inspire, and heal to grow more freely. Remember that cultivation is patient work. A single day of mindful speech may not transform everything, but consistent care creates lasting change. Words spoken with intention accumulate, strengthening relationships, nurturing empathy, and spreading positivity like ripples across water. The more you practice, the more naturally kindness becomes, until it flows effortlessly from your mind and heart into the world. Encourage others to cultivate their own gardens. Share kindness, express gratitude, and recognize the efforts of those around you. Every word you speak influences the atmosphere, and every act of verbal care helps others recognize the potential of their own speech. A culture of kindness grows not from a single act, but from countless, everyday moments of mindful communication. Even challenges become part of the garden. Misunderstandings, disagreements, or moments of tension are opportunities to practice restraint, empathy, and thoughtful response. When you navigate these situations with awareness, your words become tools of restoration, turning obstacles into fertile ground for growth. Cultivating your garden also means celebrating the beauty of the words that bloom. Notice the joy, comfort, and encouragement that arise when words are spoken from a place of sincerity. These blooms are the tangible results of consistent care, a living testament to the power of mindful speech. Finally, see your practice as ongoing. Each day is a new chance to plant seeds, water them with presence and compassion, and observe their growth. By cultivating your garden of words, you create not just a personal sanctuary of positivity, but a vibrant ecosystem where every conversation nurtures connection, understanding, and humanity. And as your garden grows, you will naturally arrive at the final understanding that every word you speak is a flower, every sentence an offering, and every conversation a chance to leave a lasting mark of kindness and virtue in the world. This is the gift that carries forward into every moment of life, waiting to be shared with those around you. As we come to the close of this journey, take a moment to reflect on the words you've heard, the ideas you've absorbed, and the garden of kindness we've explored together. From the subtle power of a single word to the vast ripple effect it can create, we've seen that speech is not mere sound. It is an offering, a reflection of the heart, and a force capable of transformation. Remember the simple image that guided us from the beginning: a flower held gently in the palm, offered without expectation. Each kind word is that flower. It carries care, intention, and presence. It is fragile yet profoundly powerful. A single word thoughtfully spoken has the ability to uplift, heal, inspire, and connect. And when offered consistently, these words accumulate, creating a forest of kindness that stretches far beyond what we can see. We have explored how words plant seeds, bloom into tangible change, and ripple outward into the world. We've understood the importance of mindful communication, reflecting inner virtue, overcoming obstacles, and practicing daily care in speech. Each chapter has been a step in discovering that our words are not neutral. They shape reality, influence others, and mirror the essence of who we are. But perhaps the most beautiful truth is this: you do not need to speak loudly, eloquently, or frequently to make a difference. The smallest gestures, a gentle compliment, a word of encouragement, a sincere acknowledgement, carry immense power. Like a single flower offered with love, even one kind word can touch a heart, shift a perspective, and set in motion ripples that travel farther than we can imagine. Imagine a world where each of us becomes a gardener of words, consciously planting seeds of positivity in every interaction, where conversations are not merely exchanges of information, but opportunities to uplift, heal, and inspire. In such a world, the ordinary becomes sacred, and the simple act of speaking transforms into a practice of love, wisdom, and compassion. As you move forward, carry this vision with you. Speak with awareness. Offer your words as gifts. Let them reflect your deepest virtues: patience, empathy, kindness, and understanding. And remember that every interaction, no matter how brief, is an opportunity to plant a flower, to leave a mark of beauty and care in the lives of others. The gift of a flower is never just the flower itself. It is the intention behind it, the thoughtfulness, and the love that accompanies it. Likewise, every word you speak can be a gift, one that nurtures, connects, and transforms. The world is waiting for these gifts, and you hold the power to offer them every day. So speak gently, speak wisely, and speak with heart. Let your words be flowers, carried not by obligation or expectation, but by the simple, profound desire to make the world a little brighter, a little kinder, and a little more alive. In giving your words, you are giving a part of yourself, and in that giving, you cultivate a life of meaning, connection, and beauty. A life where every word can bloom, every seed can grow, and every heart touched by your speech can flourish. If this message of kindness and the power of words resonated with you, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we explore timeless teachings, gentle guidance, and reflections to nurture your mind, heart, and spirit. Turn on notifications so that every week you can receive a moment of calm, a spark of insight, and a reminder that even the smallest words and actions can create ripples of positivity in your life and the world around you. And if you found value in this video, share it with someone who might need a word of encouragement today. Every gesture counts, and together we can plant seeds of mindfulness, compassion, and understanding. One word, one heart, one moment at a time. Thank you for watching, and may your words, like flowers, bloom wherever you go.